Psalm 27, verses 13 and 14, David writes, I would have lost heart unless I had believed that I would see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait on the Lord, be of good courage, and he shall strengthen your heart. Wait, I say on the Lord, he says again, I would have lost heart unless I had believed that I would see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. In this psalm, we discover that even David had moments of doubt, despair, and distress, that even David wondered whether or not he'd be able to survive his ordeal. But we discover that his faith in God helped him to be able to hold it together when his life began to fall apart. Looking through the rearview mirror of all he had gone through, he said to himself, I am determined to survive. And in this psalm, David shares with us some survival strategies on how to survive tough times. Let me give you all three of them. David says, in order to survive tough times, one, you've got to admit the possibility of fainting. Number two, you've got to acknowledge the power of your faith. But then thirdly, you've got to admonish yourself to have fortitude. Number one, admit the possibility of fainting. Verse 13, listen to how it opens up. David says, I would have lost heart. King James Version says, I would have fainted. David says, I came to a place of despair. I had come to the black night of my soul. I was so deeply depressed and distressed. I was so down in the dumps that I wanted to throw in the towel. He says, I would have lost heart. I almost fainted. And I know these words seem out of place in Psalm 27 in light of how the psalm opens up. You remember David opens this psalm almost bragging about how certain he was that God was going to take care of him. He opened the psalm bristling with confidence. He said, the Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? When the wicked, even my enemies and my foes, came upon me to eat up my flesh, they stumbled and fell, though an host should encamp against me. My heart shall not fear, though war should rise against me. In this will I be confident. He opened the psalm with such a high note of confidence, bragging about the Lord and about how certain he was that God was going to take care of him. But then all of a sudden, he plunged into the very depths of despair. Listen to what he goes on to write in verse 7. In verse 7, the mood changes, and you got to remember the flow. He's saying, the Lord is my light, my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. But then when he gets to verse 7, he says, hear me, O Lord, when I cry with my voice. Have mercy upon me and answer me. Hide not your face far from me. Don't put me away. Don't leave me. Don't forsake me. Don't deliver me over to the will of my enemies. They want to get me, and they're breathing out violence. Wait a minute, David. You just opened up on such a high note. You were bragging about the Lord being your light and your salvation. And since he was, you said you weren't going to be afraid of anything or anyone. But now you're begging God not to leave you and begging him not to forsake you. What's the matter with you, David? Seems like you're on some kind of emotional roller coaster where one moment you're up and then the very next moment you're down. And I came by to tell you, if you've never been there, just keep on living. That's where many of us are right now. We're in that emotional roller coaster place where it seems like we're up one minute and down the next. David says, I almost lost heart. I almost fainted. What's the matter with you, David? You were the same guy who wrote the 23rd Psalm. And David says, yeah, you are correct. I did write the 23rd Psalm, but I wrote that on one of my strong days. And today is not one of those days. David says, if you let me be transparent and honest, I'll tell you that every day of my life, I didn't always feel strong, but sometimes I felt like throwing in the towel. Sometimes I felt like giving up. Sometimes I felt like God was hiding his face from me. David says, I need you to understand that it can happen to the best of us. It happened to John the Baptist. When they threw him into prison, he became so depressed that he told his followers, go ask Jesus, is he the one, or shall we look for another? It can happen to the best of us. Even Jesus was so depressed in the Garden of Gethsemane that he said, my soul is sorrowful even unto death. You need to remind the people that it can happen. If it can happen to me, and if it can happen to John the Baptist, and if it can happen to Jesus, then it can happen to them as well. And all I'm trying to say today is that if you want to survive tough times, you need to stop trying to deny the reality that times are tough. I need to tell you the recession is real. The virus is deadly. The doctor's diagnosis is what it says it is. The wayward child is doing what they're doing. David says, I'm not going to live in denial, but I'm going to admit and I'm going to acknowledge that fainting is a real possibility. It happens to the best of us, and it can happen to the rest of us. I came by on assignment from heaven to tell you today that if you want to survive these tough times that we are now facing, do not live in denial. Hear me when I tell you, authentic faith does not deny the reality of the truth, but authentic faith says, yes, the recession may be real, but my God shall supply all of my needs according to his riches and glory. Authentic faith says, yes, the pandemic is real, but with God and another day and another breath, I know I'm going to make it through. If you want to survive tough times, you've got to admit that there is a real possibility of fainting. But not only must you admit the possibility of fainting, but then secondly, you've got to acknowledge the power of your faith. David said, I would have fainted unless I had believed. David said, I had come to that precipice in life when my back was against the wall. I had come to a point in my life where I was on the brink of losing my faith, but I believe. Now notice that David didn't have to see anything. All he had to do was believe. We say that seeing is believing, but the Bible teaches that believing is seeing. And David says, I would have fainted except unless I had believed. It had not happened yet, but David believed. And what a word for the church today, that if you are going to get to your blessing, you must, in the midst of your circumstances, still believe God. If you're going to get the victory, you must see beyond your current circumstances and see yourself victorious. If you cannot see it now, you're never going to get there. That's why Hebrews 11:1 says, faith is the substance of things hoped for. It is the evidence of things not yet seen. You don't need faith if you can already see it, but until you get it, you need to see it in your spirit. I don't have to get a breakthrough right now. I just believe that God is coming and a breakthrough is on the way. If you could just believe, I came by to tell you your smile would come back. You'd start singing a song of praise again. Joy would come back to you if you could just believe. He believed. In other words, it was his faith that kept him. And can I tell you that there are no quick fixes to the problems of life? That you can name it and claim it, blab it and grab it, call it and haul it. And even when you've done doing all of that, the problems and the pressures of life will still be there. David said, I would have lost heart. I would have fainted unless I had believed that I was going to see the goodness of the Lord. I came by to tell you today, he says that David said in verse 12, he said, my enemies had bad plans for me. They were breathing out threats against me. And it almost drove me into a depression. But then I got to verse 13, because in verse 13, God opened my eyes so that I could see the goodness of the Lord. I'm preaching to somebody today who feels like giving up and throwing in the towel, but I came by to tell you, don't give up. That means you're just in verse 12. But if you hold on to your faith will push you out of verse 12 and push you right into verse 13. I came by to tell you, you're one verse away from your breakthrough, one verse away from God turning things around, one verse away from a new day, a new start, a new chance, a new opportunity, a new beginning, you're just one verse away from being at the place where you'll look back and say, the enemy meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. You're just one verse away. David wrote the 23rd Psalm. And in fact, David wrote a whole lot of the other Psalms. He wrote this 27th Psalm, and at a time he was about to give up, except he believed he was going to see the goodness of the Lord in the land. David, where are you going to see the goodness? Are you talking about in the eschatological by and by, when you stand before God in heaven? David said, no, I'm going to see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. May I say to you that faith always tells you that you can make it. And I came by to tell you, to the person who's gotten a bad report from the doctor, faith says you're going to make it. To the family that's facing financial difficulties, faith says that you're going to make it. To the family with the wayward child, faith says you're going to make it. You need to understand that I'm going to make it. You need to start to tell yourself, yes, I'm going to make it. I may have to cry sometime, but I'm going to make it. I may have to crawl, but I'm going to make my pillow may sometimes get wet with tears, but I'm going to make it. It's tough right now, but I'm going to make it. You want to survive, you've got to admit the possibility of fainting. You've got to acknowledge the power of your faith. But here's the last thing. You've got to admonish yourself to have fortitude. Watch what he says in verse 14. Wait on the Lord. Wait on the Lord because God works in his own time. Wait on the Lord. He says, wait on the Lord. And while you're waiting, look, hope for, expect some stuff to happen. David says, soul, I know it looks bad, but expect some stuff to happen. Expect God to show up. Expect God to move. Wait on the Lord. And then he said, be of good courage. It means to be strong. It's two admonitions there. He says, wait and be strong. I wondered, to whom was David speaking when he said, wait and be strong? One commentator said, in addition to speaking to the Hebrews that were worshiping in the crowd, David was also speaking to himself. It was as if his stronger self said to his weaker self, I know it looks bad, but wait and be strong. It's as if the believing part of his soul spoke to the doubting part of his soul and says, soul, wait and be strong. It's as if he stepped outside of himself and grabbed himself by the collar and said, you've been talking about quitting, get a grip. You talking about giving up, get a grip. Wait and be strong. Don't let the facts mess with your faith. Wait and be strong are admonitions in what is called the imperative mood, which simply means that it's not a suggestion, but it's a command. That David is commanding himself to wait and to be strong. And sometimes you've got to take control of your mind and your emotions and take command of yourself. And you got to tell yourself, self, we are not going out like this. We are going to make it. We are going to survive. We will live and not die. We are going to be on the top and not the bottom. Wait and be strong. Wait on the Lord. Be of good courage. If you want this message in its entirety, you can send me you can just email me your email address and I'll send you the message in its entirety. God bless you and God keep you is our prayer.